When German forces invaded Belgium in May 1940, Anne Brusselmans lived in downtown Brussels with her husband and their two children, Jacques and Yvonne. Anne spoke English fluently, being the daughter of a British mother and a Belgian father. Not long after the Germans occupied Belgium, underground members approached her about helping the Allied cause by translating wireless messages coming from England. Her daughter tells how this first contact with the underground grew into a much larger involvement.
The minister of our church came knocking on the door. We had just come back from being refugees on the road for 31 days, and asked my mother, who spoke very good English, to translate some BBC programs into French and then distribute them to patriots. Well, that was not too much of a problem and not too dangerous. But then what happened next is that the minister came back and asked us, or asked my mother, if she would take a British airman. Of course, Americans were not in the war yet. So she discussed it with my father, and they said, well, we would like to have somebody do the same thing for our son, Jacques, if this happened to him. So we had the Bill Norfolk, who was the first British airman. And then we had a Canadian, and then we had a New Zealander, and then the Americans came into the war, and we ended up with quite a few. I never knew who they were until one day when I asked my mother, and she said, well, they're Flemish cousins. And so they don't speak French, we don't speak Flemish, so we will speak English to them. Well, that went along very well until one day I thought, well, I have one uncle and two cousins, and I now have given up my bed to 32 Flemish cousins, and I said, there's definitely something wrong here. There was an air raid. We were down in the cellar, and I was sort of looking around, passing time, and I found a metal box, which I still have, as a matter of fact, and found the pictures of my so-called Flemish cousins and ID cards and paraphernalia that my mother needed. And I went up and I said, I know who these Flemish cousins are now. And of course, then it wasn't fun anymore, because it then became dangerous. You had to be very quiet at school. You could not say that your house was invaded by 3, 4 Allied airmen.
Powerful threats to the underground came from Belgians who collaborated with the Germans and from German moles who impersonated Allied airmen to infiltrate the underground.
When the Germans moved into Brussels, they plastered notices all over the place, and it was probably more because of helping Allied airmen. There was a notice saying, if you help an Allied airman in any way, you will not, there will not be a trial. You will be arrested and you will be shot. And it scared a lot of people away, but and that is probably why it was so difficult to find some safe houses to put them in. Money speaks. Money speaks. If you handed an airman to any German soldier, you would get Belgian money back in the 40s of 43, 10,000 Belgian francs. That is a lot of money in our days. So people also had read the notices, and they thought that Britain had it. They didn't see the Americans come into the war, so they said, let's keep on the right side of the street. And were then collaborating, and of course if they could give up somebody, more glory to them. Also remember that a lot of the young Germans who were in American universities spoke very good English, and they were the ones who were chosen as moles. knew everything about baseball, everything about the movie stars, so you couldn't really catch them on things like that. In 1939, a lot of these young men went back to the fatherland to help Germany fight America and England. So it was touch and go. And of course, Moles managed to get into the line and probably would be going down all the way to the Pyrenees and then come back and pick everybody up. The Germans had moles in the schools, and we had a little Jewish friend of mine, and she was still at school, and they came, they picked her up. We knew then that we would never see her again. My mother used to go to a second-hand shop, and she would pick the clothes, sort of having made sure that they were maybe 6'1" or 6'2". Of course, as I said, the clothes never fit. She did that for a while, and then one day, two of the men there, who were sympathizers, but she didn't know until then, said, well, why don't you bring the men down here? It'd be a lot easier for you to choose the clothes. And she realized what they were up to, and the following day she told some of her friends, and they took care of the two gentlemen, and the store was closed, and I think that the men took a walk in the woods too.
Because of the constant risk from German moles posing as Allied airmen, underground members interrogated airmen carefully to authenticate their identities.
At first, it was easy. England sent questionnaires, and in the questionnaires you had to give your name, rank, and where you came from, your bomber group, what your mission was, who your crew members were, and then it also gave a description of the scar, the hurt, whether you were wounded, what had happened to the crew. Your crew. Sometimes she had a problem. They would just say name, rank, and serial number. But then she would explain to them, look, I need to make sure that you are not a mole. And the way I can do that is that if you tell me you're on a B-17 or a B-24, there's 10 men on your crew. If you can give me the names of the crew that you were with, and usually they had a pretty steady crew. So one airman could corroborate the story of another.
After confirming that an Allied airman was really who he claimed to be, the underground provided false identity papers. Then, if the airman was an American, they taught him to avoid mannerisms that could give him away as being an American.
The ID cards had to be stolen from the cities, the towns, and usually they were taken from a town that had been bombed out, because that way there were no records left, and the Germans could not go and look at the records and find that there is no such man as Jean Weygand or whatever. The stamps that had to go on these documents had to be forged. So they were stolen, forged that night, and returned the following day to the city hall. They had these commandateur papers, some kind of work papers. Somebody had to forge the signature of the commandant. Then our job was to teach the men their new name and to answer questions, what is your name? And we would suddenly say, oh, quel est votre nom? And they would have to answer Jean Weygand or whatever. In England and in America, and mostly in America, you cut your meat, you lay down the knife, and you eat with a fork. And even to this day, I try and be an American since I'm an American now, but I don't think I will ever be able to eat with just the fork. There was not only that, is the lighting a cigarette with a match. I would notice that they were always shielding the flame. And now that would have been something that the Germans would pick up. You know, if you're lighting a cigarette with a match and you're on an airfield, you will shield the flame. And that was something. Well, there were many, many things that you had to teach them. That jingling money in their pockets was another thing. Or looking around the architecture as if they were on a Cook's tour. You didn't know, you shouldn't have done that.
Eventually, Anne Brusselmans helped over 130 Allied airmen evade successfully. Everyone in her immediate family survived the war, and Allied governments gave her high honors. But even a successful underground agent like Anne Brusselmans paid a high price for freedom.
My parents had enough money to build a house before the war. And when they discussed whether they would help airmen or not, they thought about the financial. My parents were not well off, but they did have that amount of money for a house. And my father's favorite remark was, "You can't eat bricks, so let's use the money and we'll see afterwards." Well, we ran out of money. When we were liberated, or very soon after we were liberated, the Allies offered to repay the Baron Orca and my mother. And they both said, you know, that was part of our duty. We had nothing left. She had to go to work. We had sheets that had holes in. We had wooden shoes. We didn't have a thing left, and definitely not money for a house.
Marguerite Brouard and her family were British citizens living in Normandy when the Germans invaded France. Her father was arrested at once. Marguerite and her mother were in Paris when the underground approached them about helping Allied flyers.
We lived in Normandy, and when the Germans invaded France, they were arresting all the British subjects, and my father and mother were British subjects because they were born in the Channel Islands in Guernsey and Jersey, and when they got married they went to live in France. So my father was arrested first. We didn't know where he was for 3 months. Then my mother was told if she had relatives in Paris to leave Normandy and go there, that she might be safer. I was living in Paris at the time with an aunt of mine. Our friend Maud had a dentist who was in the underground, and he asked her if we could hide American airmen, and so she discussed it with my mother and they accepted to do that.
Marguerite and her mother experienced firsthand the danger of underground infiltration by German moles.
We said we could be caught and we could be sent to concentration camps. The children could be tortured in front of the parents and things like that. So we had a narrow escape. We had 2 airmen who were brought to us once, and we were told to watch them because they were very suspicious. They were supposed to be 2 American airmen. They had a very likable story. They spoke perfect American, and but their behavior was strange. They were looking through everything, papers and all that, in the homes where they had been previous to ours, and they did the same at our place. And we found out that they thought they were German spies, and we had them for a few nights at our place. And I recall my mother-in-law coming. My future mother-in-law was also in the underground at the time, and she came to fetch them and took them along the Seine, and supposedly they were shot.
Despite the danger, Marguerite and her mother hosted 17 flyers on their way to freedom.
Well, we had 17 altogether. We had 11 who stayed 3 weeks each. They used to come 2 by 2, and then some others only stayed 2-3 nights. Others stayed just 1 night. They were waiting to have all the arrangements made for them to go to Spain. Then the last one we had was British, and he was supposed to be a British spy, and they had posters all over Paris that, you know, if anybody would turn him in, they would get 1 million. I don't know how many francs at the time. So he was very, very scared. And we only had him for a few days too. And they took him away. And after that, they said, we can't bring you anybody else. That he was the last one. Because our apartment building had been watched. We had a friend who had been taken to Buchenwald, tortured and died. And my mother-in-law had been followed. She had to also leave her apartment. So the Germans were getting very close on us. So we had to stop. Well, it was a little frightening. I guess it was more frightening for my mother and Maud than for me. Maud got a nervous breakdown and she tried to commit suicide. I think she was very depressed and she was hungry all the time. She couldn't take it.
Why did Anne Brusselmans, Alice Brouard, and thousands of others risk the lives of themselves and their families to help Allied airmen?
Freedom has a price, and it's only when you've lost it for 4 years that you realize what it means to you.
I mean, it was awful to be occupied by the Germans and not to have our freedom. So I think that's a good enough reason.